In July 2002, the United States government delivered an ultimatum to a regional military commander in the Persian Gulf. They had 8 demands. The last one, unconditional surrender. The commander read it over. He had just over 24 hours to comply. He had no intention of complying. He had seen this coming. He knew that the moment the American fleet steamed into the Gulf, they would strike first. The Bush administration had announced a preemption doctrine. This commander had simply taken it seriously. If they were coming regardless, the only question would be timing. He already knew his plan. His forces were inferior in every conventional category. Fewer ships, older technology, no air superiority, but he didn't intend to fight conventionally. During the call to prayer the next morning, coded messages went out from the minarets of mosques across the region. That was the signal. His forces launched a barrage of cruise missiles from ground positions, commercial vessels, and low-flying aircraft with their radios off to avoid radar detection. Small boats loaded with explosives swarmed the U.S. fleet in kamikaze runs. The Aegis radar system, designed to track and intercept incoming missiles, was overwhelmed by the volume of incoming threats. In the span of about 10 minutes, 16 warships were sank. 1 aircraft carrier, 10 cruisers, 5 of 6 amphibious assault ships. More than 20,000 American service members were killed. One important detail, none of this was real. It was a simulation modeled by a computer. There were no casualties, no sunk ships, no cruise missiles. The commander was a retired United States Marine Lieutenant General named Paul Van Riper, and he had just simulated the destruction of the American fleet on behalf of the United States government in the most expensive military wargame exercise in history to demonstrate that the doctrine the exercise was designed to stress test could potentially get thousands of Americans killed. The exercise was halted, the fleet was refloated, the doctrine was validated anyway. Welcome back to The 10th Man. I'm Chris Porden. This is episode 9. Last episode, we examined Theranos, where every institutional mechanism of challenge was formally present and informationally starved. The board had authority, but it lacked the expertise and data to use it. Trade secret claims blocked peer review. NDAs and legal threats blocked whistleblowers. The information required for challenge never reached the mechanisms designed to perform it. This episode is a very different case. The Millennium Challenge 2002. The mechanism of challenge worked at first. It produced exactly the information it was designed to produce. And when that information provided an answer the consensus didn't want to hear, the institution rewrote the entire mechanism. To understand what happened in July 2002, you need to understand what was at stake in the geopolitical environment of the time. Since the early 1990s, a theory had been building inside American defense circles. The Gulf War had appeared to demonstrate that superior technology and precision operations could compress the timeline for military victory, reduce casualties, and achieve decisive outcomes very quickly. The theory that grew from this observation was called network-centric warfare. Its core claim was that connecting military units through shared information networks would allow smaller, faster forces to dominate larger ones through what they called speed of command. By 2001, this theory had a powerful patron. Donald Rumsfeld arrived as Secretary of Defense, determined to transform the U.S. military around it. The uniformed services, particularly the U.S. Army, were told to demonstrate that this transformation worked, that network-centric warfare translated from theory to operational reality. The key vehicle for that demonstration was to be the Millennium Challenge 2002. Mandated by Congress, planned over 2 years, executed across more than 24 real-world locations, MCO2 involved 13,500 participants, a combination of live forces and computer simulations, and a price tag of $250 million. Joint Forces Command described the exercise's purpose, that MCO2 was the key to military transformation. Rumsfeld visited JFCOM headquarters to endorse it personally. He said, "This exercise will test the forces and equipment that will help us judge and define both near-term and future capabilities." The scenario was set in 2007, 5 years in the future, to justify some capabilities the United States didn't yet fully possess. The adversary, designated Red, was a regional power in the Persian Gulf, controlling a vital strategic waterway, possessing weapons of mass destruction, with ties to terrorist groups. The regime was officially unnamed, but the scenario looked unmistakably like Iraq or Iran. Participants noted that the blue team's campaign plan closely resembled the running start plan that CENTCOM was simultaneously developing for the anticipated invasion of Iraq. The timing, of course, was not incidental. This was August 2002. The decision whether to invade Iraq was being actively debated within the Bush administration. MCO2 was the test. If the doctrine held, the coming invasions approach was validated before ever putting real boots on the ground. To lead the Red Team, Joint Forces Command selected Paul K. Van Riper. Van Riper was 63 years old and had been retired from the Marine Corps for 5 years. He was twice decorated with the Silver Star, a Vietnam combat veteran, a former commanding general of the 2nd Marine Division. He was also, by reputation, rather difficult and an unconventional thinker with a long record of skepticism toward this supposed revolution in military affairs. JFCOM selected him specifically because he was expected to stress test the system, a, quote, devious sort of guy, in the characterization of JFCOM Commander General Kernan, and a no-nonsense, solid professional warfighter. Van Riper entered MCO2 with a point of view. He believed that the untested transformation concepts were dangerous and that they would be applied to an actual invasion of Iraq before anyone knew whether they worked. So he intended to find out. He'd also been promised free play. Previous Red Team exercises, in his experience, had been unrealistic and overly scripted. He was told MCO2 would be different, a genuine test, both sides earnestly trying to win. He took that promise seriously. Van Riper assessed his starting position. Red was inferior by every conventional metric. Blue had advanced surveillance technology, precision weapons, air superiority, and a carrier battle group. In a conventional engagement, Red would lose quickly. He didn't plan a conventional engagement. He knew that the network-centric warfare doctrine depended on a specific assumption, that adversaries would behave predictably, would communicate in ways that could be monitored by signals intelligence, and would use forces that could be detected and targeted. Blue's operational tools included an operational net assessment, a system that modeled an adversary's vulnerabilities and predicted what Van Riper was most likely to do next, drawn from a predetermined range of possible scenarios. Van Riper's response to a predetermined range of scenarios was to refuse to operate within any of them. When Blue destroyed Red's microwave towers and fiber optic links, they expected Van Riper to shift to satellite phones and cellular communications, which could be monitored. Instead, he used motorcycle couriers. He used light signals from airfields, the kind of communication method not commonly used since World War II, to launch aircraft without radio contact at all. His code to initiate the attack, transmitted from the minarets of mosques, the call to prayer, was undetectable by any surveillance system that Blue possessed. He preempted the preemptor. When Blue issued the 8-point ultimatum, Van Riper took it as confirmation that the fleet would be moving in. He struck first. The cruise missiles came from commercial ships and planes flying low without transponders. The speedboats came in swarms faster than the Aegis tracking system could sequence and engage. The attack lasted only 10 minutes. The carrier battle group was gone. Blue Team Commander Lieutenant General B.B. Bell later described it as a watershed moment. Van Riper had attacked adoctrinally, in a manner commanders were entirely unprepared for. Bell said everybody learned from it. What happened next is the real subject of this episode. The exercise was halted. Exercise controllers faced a big problem. They had assembled 13,500 people across dozens of sites for this high-profile 3-week exercise. The exercise was scheduled to test multiple concepts sequentially. The Red Fleet attack had ended the central scenario almost immediately. Stopping entirely was, in a practical sense, impossible. So, a reset was ordered. The sunken fleet was refloated. Blue forces were restored to full strength. Red forces were given new constraints. Here's what those constraints required. Van Riper's forces were ordered to turn on their anti-aircraft radar so that Blue could locate and destroy them. During a combined amphibious assault by the 82nd Airborne and Marines, Red was ordered not to shoot down incoming aircraft that its systems would have accurately targeted in reality. Red was ordered to avoid using certain weapon systems. Red was ordered to reveal the locations of its own units to exercise controllers who then passed that information to Blue. Van Riper protested. He objected that the exercise had ceased to test concepts and had become little more than a demonstration. His staff began receiving instructions directly from the exercise control group that contradicted his orders, undermining command unity. He resigned from active participation 6 days into the exercise, taking just a nominal advisory role for the remainder. He wrote a 21-page critique, which they immediately classified. He spoke publicly anyway. He told The Guardian in 2002, "Nothing was learned from this. A culture not willing to think hard and test itself does not augur well for the future." The official response came from Vice Admiral Marty Mayer, who ran the exercise. "General Van Riper apparently feels he was too constrained. I can only say there were certain parts where he was not constrained, and then there were parts where he was in order to facilitate the conduct of the experiment." Navy Captain John Carmen, the JFCOM spokesman, announced that the wargame had properly validated all the major concepts tested by Blue Force. The after-action report, classified at the time, confirmed in its own language that as the exercise progressed, the OP4 free play was eventually constrained to the point where the end state was scripted. OP4 is shorthand for opposing forces. The account you've just heard is Paul Van Riper's account. It's the account that appeared in The Guardian in 2002, in Malcolm Gladwell's book Blink in 2005, in dozens of retrospectives across the 2 decades that followed. It is accurate in its essentials, but it's also incomplete. The most thorough alternative analysis was published in War on the Rocks in 2015 by Micah Zenko, drawn from interviews with senior officials who were involved and from the after-action report that JFCOM declassified in 2010. Its central argument is that the shortcomings of MCO2 were, in important respects, inevitable, and the conventional narrative obscures both the structural complexity of running an exercise at that scale and the significant ways Van Riper's own conduct contributed to the breakdown. Here's the most important specific point on this. One analysis written by a former defense analyst identified a technical problem in the simulation itself. The Naval Defense Systems model couldn't operate in an environment with heavy real-world civilian traffic. It kept trying to shoot down airliners. The model eventually had to be turned off. The actual amphibious exercise was restricted to this narrow box in order to avoid interfering with real civilian shipping traffic. When ships entered into that box, the simulation updated their digital positions to match their real-world locations, which placed them much closer to shore than they would have been in actual real-world combat operations. Van Riper had a clean shot at them that no real adversary would probably have had. The reset, on this account, was not simply an attempt to protect the doctrine from a genuine result. It was, at minimum, in part, a response to a simulation that had malfunctioned when it collided with real-world constraints. Zenko's analysis adds, Bell, the Blue Team commander, described the exercise as a genuine learning experience. He believed Van Riper did exactly what a Red Team commander should do. Bell became one of the military's most outspoken proponents of red teaming and estimates he later directed the formation of at least 20 individual red teams while commanding throughout Europe and Korea. So these are real complications. Van Riper was not simply a truth teller, silenced by an institution protecting its conclusions. The exercise wasn't simply a rigged demonstration masquerading as a test. The picture is a lot more complex than that. And then there's the after-action report. JFCOM's own language. Free play, quote, eventually constrained to the point where the end state was scripted. That's not Van Riper's characterization. That's the institution itself. The complication softens the edges of the story a bit, but it doesn't change its shape. The official announcement that the wargame had properly validated all the major concepts was made in the full knowledge of what those constraints had required. Every episode of this series has documented a different mechanism by which institutional challenge has failed. There's a distinction that the Millennium Challenge makes visible, and it's worth naming. A testing mechanism is designed to find out whether something is true. A validation exercise is designed to confirm what has already been decided. The distinction isn't always clean in practice. Most large exercises contain some elements of both. But the difference shows in how the institution responds when the test produces what they consider to be the wrong answer. In a genuine test, a wrong answer is important information. It updates the question. It changes the design of the next experiment. In a validation exercise, a wrong answer is a malfunction. The response is to fix the malfunction until validation is achieved. Millennium Challenge began as a testing mechanism, but it quickly arrived at the wrong answer. The exercise was converted into a validation exercise in real time, and the official announcement treated the scripted result as though it were the product of a genuine test. Van Riper drew the comparison himself. He said what he saw in MCO2 echoed what he had seen as a young lieutenant in the 1960s, when McNamara's systems analysis applied to Vietnam produced a quantitative picture of progress that the people fighting the war knew was false. The computers in Saigon said the U.S. was winning. In the rice paddies, they knew otherwise. The doctrine required a certain output. The system produced it. The output and the truth diverged. Something from episode 7 applies here at the structural level. Amazon's 6-page memo was a process mechanism. It made reasoning visible so it could be attacked. The PR FAQ forced authors to articulate assumptions that could be challenged. The Millennium Challenge was also a process mechanism, a simulation designed to test whether a doctrine could survive contact with an adversary who refused to cooperate. The mechanism was converted mid-exercise into a person-dependent outcome. The end state was scripted, and the people running the exercise determined what that script said. In a sense, the mechanism worked. It produced exactly the result a functional test should produce, a finding that challenged the doctrine under examination. But the institution's response was to stop the mechanism. This is a failure class we've examined on this show from certain angles in some ways, but not quite at this scale. The mechanism was functioning properly up until the moment it was dismantled. In March 2003, 8 months after the Millennium Challenge concluded, the United States invaded Iraq. The invasion plan was grounded in the transformation doctrine that MCO2 had validated. Small, networked, agile forces, speed of command, a rapid, decisive operation that would compress the timeline of victory. The initial invasion was swift. Baghdad fell in just 3 weeks. But then the occupation began. The guerrilla resistance that emerged was structurally quite close to what Van Riper had been simulating. Decentralized, asymmetric, using low-technology methods the surveillance systems were not designed to detect. Lieutenant General William Wallace, commanding the Army's V Corps, observed in the early weeks of the conflict, the enemy we're fighting is a bit different than the one we wargamed against. And he was right. It was precisely the enemy Van Riper had tried to play for them. The Iraq War lasted nearly 9 years. Estimates of total American military deaths are over 4,400. Coalition military deaths around another 179. Iraqi deaths are contested, but credible estimates range from 100,000 to over 600,000. The transformation doctrine that MCO2 had been designed to validate did prove adequate for the opening conventional phase and totally inadequate for everything that followed it. There's no clean causal line from the scripted result of the Millennium Challenge to any specific outcomes in Iraq. Military failures of the occupation had multiple causes: political decisions, intelligence failures, inadequate planning for the post-invasion phase. MCO2 was one input into a system that had many others. What can be said about it is this: the test that would have complicated that doctrine was converted into a demonstration designed to validate it. The doctrine was applied. The complication arrived in reality instead of simulation. Van Riper's assessment in Nova in 2002, before the invasion, was, "I'm angered that an idea that has never been truly validated, that never really went through the crucible of a real experiment, is being exported to our operational forces to use." He was accurately describing a future that had not yet happened. We're 9 episodes in. We've talked about military intelligence, engineering, medicine, aviation, finance, diplomacy, corporate governance, war games, 9 domains with 9 failure modes. My argument is that the difference between institutions that survive catastrophic error and those that don't is less about the quality of their people or the sincerity of their intentions and more about whether they have made it impossible for consensus to suppress challenge. This season has 1 episode remaining. It's about a scientist who warned that his planet was going to be destroyed. He presented his evidence to the government. His evidence was comprehensive. His methods were sound. Begged them to listen. The council voted 9-1 against him. Just as he'd warned them, their planet was destroyed. Similar to the Millennium Challenge wargame scenario, this story is fictional. The structure it demonstrates is not. We've documented it across 9 real institutions through 9 real historical moments. Episode 10 will further describe that structure, examine every mechanism this series has presented so far, and ask what any of it's worth, what it actually means to build an institution capable of hearing the one voice the other 9 don't want to hear. That will be the final episode of Season 1 of the 10th Man podcast. We'll see you there.